to enter into the historic Abraham Accords, to have an economy this time last year that was stronger than I ever remember in my entire lifetime. Yeah, we'll complete the record. And in all fairness, as the president leaves 1 week from today, let's be honest about the double standards that exist inside of this chamber. And let's also be honest that this president did a lot to make America great.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to distinguished I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston.
What happens
The gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
What happens if we get this wrong is written in Lincoln's second inaugural, when one party would make war rather than let the nation survive. On December 7th, on September 11th, we came together against an enemy from without, but on January 6th, we were attacked by an enemy from within, the president who would make war with malice for all and charity for none. We must come together in unity today against that domestic threat to our Constitution. The alternative is too unbearable to contemplate. We must impeach, bipartisanly, unanimously, if you have the soul.
The gentleman from New York wishes to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Fletcher.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of the article of impeachment and in opposition to the gaslighting that is masquerading as debate in this chamber today. I was in this chamber when the president assembled and unleashed a mob to attack the United States Capitol and the United States Congress, the elected representatives of the people. By doing so, he incited an insurrection against our representative democracy itself. If that is not an impeachable offense, then what is? Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 30 seconds to distinguished gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In Michigan's 13th, we proudly speak truth to power, even in the face of a racist in chief. Those who incited an attack on the People's House do not get to talk about healing and unity. They have torn this country apart. They have stoked the fire and then handed the gasoline to Donald Trump. Dr. King once said, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension. It is in the presence of justice." Today, we must embody those words, and we must understand that peace must be centered in truth and action. We cannot sit, Madam Chair, sit idly by after a violent attempted coup and allow lies and hate to continue. Today, we stand up for our constituents who continue to be harmed by the suppression.
Wishes to reserve. The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Donald Trump.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York wishes to reserve. And the gentleman from New York has 3 3/4 minutes remaining. From Ohio has 4. And the gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What happened last Wednesday is an absolute tragedy. And not only are we part of dealing with it now, we were part of it then. But when emotions are frayed and tensions are this high, process matters more. It matters more now than it did before. And the reality is this: there are serious constitutional questions about these articles. And Donald Trump is going to be president until January 20th. And on January 20th, Joe Biden's going to become president. But I'll end with this. I'm going to vote against impeachment, and that's going to give me credibility at home with my base. You're going to vote for impeachment, and that's going to give you credibility at home with your base. It's easy to point at me and blame me. It's easy for me to point at you and blame you. But on January 21st, we're all going to be back here. So use that credibility. Go back and talk some hard truths to your people. I'm going to do it, and we need to do a better job. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. the gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, this president has repeatedly lied to the American people about his election loss. He incited his followers to attack our democracy, resulting in 5 deaths. His dangerous efforts to derail the peaceful transition of power were a violation of his oath of office. This president is unfit to lead our nation and unable to discharge his duties of office. I call upon my Republican colleagues to speak the truth to their supporters and join me in holding President Trump accountable by voting to impeach. I yield.
New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mervan.
I didn't hear where he was from. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, since the events on January 6th, I spoke with a group of ministers from Gary, Indiana, and they told me how they are praying for unity and justice in our nation. It reminded me of the moment when those of us who were on the House floor on January 6th were huddled together in a secure room after the attack. The House chaplain, Kiblin, led us all in prayer. Let us remember that moment. Let us rekindle that prayer for those 3 minutes when we were all united to preserve our democracy and justice. I support the article of impeachment so that we can move forward to do the work that our constituents sent us here to do. With that, I yield back.
Has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from New York has 2 3/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Ohio has 3. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserved. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, there are more troops right now in Washington, D.C. than in Afghanistan. And they are here to defend us against the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, and his mob. I would ask my colleagues to look at the faces of those young Americans defending democracy, defending us, and find an ounce of their courage to do the right thing, as several Republicans have, and take a tough vote for the future of democracy, for the future of our country.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York wishes to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, let's be clear about one thing. If we were on the eve of a Republican president being sworn in, and his Democratic predecessor had said the same thing that this president said, and incited his followers, his mob, to descend up on the Capitol, we will be joining them, not making comparisons, because guess what? I don't care about no base. I care about this democracy and this country. And what happened the other day should never happen again. And we need to stand up and say and do the right thing.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, the Republican whip is prepared to close for us whenever that is appropriate, so we'll reserve until that's time.
The gentleman reserves.
Madam Speaker,
I
now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
I was on that floor just 1 week ago, and so today the insurrectionist-in-chief will be impeached for insurrection. It is because he failed to defend this nation against all enemies, domestic and foreign, and he stood down near the White House and told a mob of domestic terrorists to go and show your strength, be strong. You can't gain anything because of weakness. We must hold him accountable. We can heal this nation, but he must be impeached today. We must impeach Donald J. Trump as an
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The
to do
gentleman
that
from New
now.
York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Speaker. We reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
Is the other side prepared to close?
Yes.
Then,
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker.
Yes.
I yield
the
3
gentleman
minutes.
from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the Republican whip, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank the gentleman from Ohio for yielding. Madam Speaker, our nation still mourns the unacceptable violence and anarchy that took place in this Capitol last week. As we speak, arrests are still being made, and the anarchists who stormed our Capitol are being brought to justice, as should be the case. Emotions are still high, but in this moment, we need to be focused on toning down the rhetoric and helping heal this nation as we move towards a peaceful transition of power to President-elect Joe Biden next week. My prayers, Madam Speaker, are still with Capitol Police Officers Sieknick and Liebengood, who we lost, as well as all of the Capitol Police officers who risked their lives to keep us safe. They are true heroes, and they deserve all of our applause today. Madam Speaker, I've seen the dark evil of political violence firsthand, and it needs to stop. But all of us need to be unequivocal in calling it out every single time we see it, not just when it comes from the other side of the aisle. I oppose this rushed impeachment brought forward without a single hearing. And by the way, the Senate will not even take this up until President Trump is out of office. So let's keep that in mind. It will only serve to further divide a nation that is calling out for healing. Madam Speaker, many speakers today have invoked one of our nation's greatest leaders, President Abraham Lincoln. Maybe we should follow some of Lincoln's wisdom that he's imparted upon us in moments like this. As Abraham Lincoln was giving his second inaugural address in March of 1865, Lincoln issued us a challenge. This is what he said: "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all our nations." Madam Speaker, in times like these, let us not reach out to our darkest demons, but instead, like Lincoln, seek the higher ground. May God bless this great United States of America. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we can have all this, but we have accountability too. I now yield our remaining time, 1 minute, to the distinguished Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Hoyer.
The majority of the leaders recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman for yielding. This is a troubled time, a sad time. It is a time where all of us have stood almost to a person and lamented the violence and the assault on this Capitol and the assault on democracy itself. It was right to do that. But this impeachment ought to be put in the perspective of what the Republican chair of the Republican conference said it was. She said the President of the United States summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of that attack. There has never been, she said, a greater betrayal by a president of the United States of this office, of his office, and his oath to the Constitution. That is why we are here today. That is why we are here today, just a week before that president, at the request of the American people, will leave office. And the issue is, what do we do? The 433 of us, I believe, who are here, do on behalf of the American people to respond to what Representative Cheney described happened on the 6th of January. A mob assembled by, summoned by, and then spoken to light the flame of the attack. To stop the steal. As we sat here, exercising our constitutional duty, and to his great credit, the Vice President of the United States following the Constitution of the United States of America. Notwithstanding the fact that he was opportuned by the President not to do so. That mob sent by the President to stop the steal did so for a few hours. Not the steal, but the constitutional duty that we had. And so we ask ourselves, what do we do? What is our responsibility? What should we say in light of only the Civil War as an analogy? That doesn't mean there haven't been demonstrations in Washington before and demonstrations throughout this country before. But it is the first and only physical presence other than the 9/11 attack on this nation, which came from abroad and had a plane aimed at our Capitol dome. This attack was not from abroad. It was, as Liz Cheney said, summoned, assembled, and inflamed by the President of the United States of America, who, in Liz Cheney, said words that there has never been a greater betrayal by a President of the United States of his office and his oath to the Constitution. I pride myself as a member of this Congress who for 40 years has worked in a bipartisan fashion with many of your leaders, and do to this day. But are we to remain silent in the face of Liz Cheney's saying this was the greatest betrayal of the duty of the President of the United States in history? Are we to stand silent? Will we stand silent? Will we not stand up and say, this is not acceptable? Madam Speaker, for 4 years, Donald Trump has made no effort to hide his ambitions or his lacking of Republican principles. Not our principles, but the principles that Abraham Lincoln was just quoted as having said. Your president, our president, has never displayed those in the 4 years he's been president of the United States. He has allowed a little constraint on his worst inclinations. His desire for autocracy and his glorification of violence have not been tempered, but rationalized by those who sought to profit financially and politically from their proximity to power. Upon the foundations of virtue, reason, and patient wisdom laid down by George Washington as our first president, Donald Trump has constructed a glass palace of lies, fear-mongering, and sedition. Last Wednesday, on January 6th, the nation and the world watched it shatter to pieces. There can be no mistaking any longer the kind of man sitting in the Oval Office or his intentions and capabilities. The curtain has been pulled back. The office to which he was elected could not temper or reform him. Washington's legacy was passed down to us not as written decrees. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The gentleman's correct. The House will be in order.
Washington's legacy was passed down to us not as written decrees, but understood norms. How we ought to act, how we ought to conduct ourselves. Term after term, each occupant has observed those norms out of a recognition that our Constitution's articles are not the only preservative of our democracy. For more than 2 centuries, Madam Speaker, whenever those norms were tested and strained, good and virtuous citizens on both sides of the aisle found common purpose in reaffirming those norms. But memory fades, and from time to time it must be refreshed. Madam Speaker, as the framers emerged from the Constitution Convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked whether they had made America a monarchy or a republic. Probably all of us know this response. A republic, he answered, if you can keep it. That's the question today. If we can keep it. And the way we keep it is to say no to actions and words that do not promote the keeping of that republic. For millennia, people have understood that a republic is only as stable and lasting as the citizens and leaders who commit themselves to its upkeep. This president has shown us he's not committed to that project. His tweets every day have shown he is not committed to that project. Indeed, he openly disdains it and appears to prefer the alternative. But what of the rest of us? Those who have the honor and the great privilege and the weighty responsibility to represent the views of 750,000 of our fellow citizens. We in this Congress have an opportunity, no, a duty, to demonstrate our commitment, both as leaders and as citizens, to keeping America a republic. A republic that resolves its differences not through being ordered to come to the Capitol to prevent them from stealing the election, which was an absurd assertion from the very first day it was made. We cannot erase the last 4 years, Madam Speaker. We cannot turn back the clock, but we can look to the ideals and principles inherited from great presidents like Washington, like Jefferson, and yes, certainly like Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, and from outstanding Americans like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Susan Anthony, Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King, Thurgood Marshall, our beloved John Lewis, and yes, RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who taught us a lot about equality and inclusion. It's up to us to restore the vibrancy, Madam Speaker, of our democracy by reaffirming our commitment to the norms they passed on to us and entrusted to our care. But to make that possible, Madam Speaker, we must rise to this moment and not only affirm the virtues we cherish, but reject the vices we abhor. That's what I'm asking my fellow representatives on both sides of the aisle to do today. We all stood and we abhorred the violence that occurred and the threat to the very democracy that we hold so dear and swore an oath to protect and uphold. Reject deceit. Reject fear-mongering. Reject sedition, tyranny, and insurrection. Reject the demand for fealty to one man over fidelity to one's country. When I addressed the House during the debate over the articles of impeachment in December 2019, I said the following: we need not ask who will be the first to show our courage by standing up to President Trump. The question we must ask: who will be the last to find it? Senator McConnell, Representative Cheney, a number of other representatives who have spoken on this floor with great courage, Madam Speaker, because there is much fear of Donald Trump. There's much fear of Donald Trump's tweets. There's much fear of Donald Trump's retribution for opposition. In my view, Donald Trump demands absolute loyalty and gives none in return. I hope others will join Liz Cheney. I hope others will be honest with themselves and with their constituents. As Liz Cheney was saying, there has never been a greater portrayal by a president of the United States of his office and his oath to the Constitution. Don't dismiss that. She's the daughter of a vice president of the United States who was the whip when I came to Congress. As she has taken a stand, I hope others will as well, Madam Speaker. Soon, the clerk will call the roll and ask for our votes. Make no mistake, this will be no ordinary roll call. This is about our country, our Constitution, and our democracy. These votes will be inscribed on the roll of history, a record of courage and of our commitment to country and Constitution, of our commitment to the rule of law and renewal of that which we inherited and hope to pass on, unbroken, unshattered. With just 7 days left in the president's term, this vote is not about timing. It is about principle and fidelity to our Constitution. It concerns the clear and present danger facing our country, not only in these final days of the Trump administration, but in the weeks, months, and years that will follow. It is about the necessity to demonstrate to this generation and to future generations the duty we share to protect our democracy every single day. Do not pretend, my friends, that it was simply those who came into the Capitol, encouraged by our president to stop the steal at any cost. And by the way, if the vice president doesn't do my bidding and follows the Constitution, sweep him away. We know that this president would never emulate George Washington and give up his power for the good of our republic, even after losing an election. Somebody talked about a peaceful transition. There has not been a peaceful transition. I don't know what you're talking about. You're not living in the same country I am. It was just days ago that the president, after committing this terrible act, thought he had to admit that Joe Biden might, yes, be president of the United States. We know that this president neither recognizes norms nor reflects the rule of law. We know that this president is not a patriot. So I ask this House, who among us, Madam Speaker, will be recorded on the roll of history for their courage, their commitment, the Constitution, and their country? We do this today not for politics. We don't need this for politics. Georgia showed that. There was no mistake in this election. We do this today to preserve and protect this great democracy. We do it for the America we love, our America the beautiful, whose founders' sacrifices we praise in song. Oh, beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. Sadly, Madam Speaker, as our current president, the appropriate words would be, who less than self his country loved, and victory more than truth. Vote for this, for America, for our Constitution, for democracy, for history. I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 41, the previous question is ordered on the resolution. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized. For what reason?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We'd ask for a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by an electronic device.
Well, you heard the voice vote there a moment ago on the resolution, but now it will go to the roll call here, and it will take a considerable amount of time. But Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, delivering the final arguments for the Democrats-led push to impeach Donald Trump on the single article incitement of insurrection. This follows more than 2 hours of debate, Republicans and Democrats taking turns to frame their positions. Not a lot of defense on the Republican side for the president's actions by themselves, but plenty of charges of hypocrisy on the point of Democrats. I want to bring in right now Savannah Guthrie, who's co-anchoring our coverage with me. Savannah, it's a foregone conclusion that Democrats have the votes to pass this, but notably, they will have some Republican support.
Yes, this will be the second impeachment vote against President Donald Trump, but the first bipartisan one. And we just learned of a seventh Republican who has crossed the aisle to say that he will vote yes in favor of impeachment. And we'll know more as this roll call vote unfolds. It's happening over the course of the next few minutes here. I want to bring in Chuck Todd. And Chuck, keep your ear out because we're watching what's happening on the House floor right now.
Right.
As we understand it, this roll call vote will take a few moments, and then we'll have a sense of how many Republicans have broken ranks. But the one that sort of broke the dam is Liz Cheney, the #3 Republican in the House, obviously from a Republican dynasty family. Her father was vice president. How important was that decision in terms of bringing more Republicans on board?
Well, I think between her and Mitch McConnell's comments, where he let it be known that he's open to a conviction in the Senate, I think it sent a signal that essentially, certainly from the establishment wing of the party, where they stand on this. And in fact, that was my chief observation on this debate over the last 3 hours. It was not what was said, it was who was doing the speaking. Here's all you need to know. The leadership of the Republican Party in the House is made up not only of those three leaders that we hear a lot about, McCarthy, Scalise, and Liz Cheney, but you also have the ranking members, the people that would be committee chairs if they were in power. Those are also leadership positions. Just one ranking committee member spoke today, and that's Jim Jordan. 15 others did not speak at all. Meanwhile, 16 Freedom Caucus members, the most devoted group of House Republicans to Donald Trump, did. The fact is, that's the unknown that I'm watching for here. I wouldn't be, those are the folks that would follow Liz Cheney, would be these folks here. In fact, one of these ranking members, John Katkow, is already on the record for impeachment. And one other point here to just show you how unprecedented this is. There are already more members of the president's own party voting to impeach him than did Bill Clinton or Andrew Johnson. Savannah.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the folks speaking today, largely the true believers, Trump's most ardent supporters in the Congress. We want to go to Casey Hunt now, who's on the Hill for us. It was interesting to hear Kevin McCarthy, who is the the Republican leader in the House, and he seemed to try to walk a very fine line, didn't he?
He did, Savannah, and I think it reflects exactly what you were just talking about with Chuck, which is the division and frankly the deep sense of fear and anger that Republicans are feeling right now. Yes, Trump's hardest core supporters in the House have stood up today and defended him, but Kevin McCarthy, who is the leader of all Republicans in the House, he came up and he said that while I can't support impeachment, I will support censure of this president. And he also said very clearly the president and that Joe Biden won the election. And while it's pretty remarkable that those two, or that last thing is something that's been hard for Republicans to say, it has been. And so making that declaration has become a line in the sand for Republicans. And the fact that it was the top Republican leader who went to the floor and made the speech that seemed most critical, perhaps, of President Trump, for someone who, of course, is not voting for impeachment, very notable and tells you just how divided things are here in the House. And remember, too, the House of Representatives has always been the place where you've seen the most pro-Trump Republicans in Washington come from. They are answering to constituents in districts where he is extremely popular. A couple of the newly elected members, frankly, are conspiracy theorists who have been involved in some of the types of thinking that ultimately motivated those groups to come to Washington. And that is part of why there's a lot of fear in the House of Representatives, why there are magnetometers now checking members who are heading down to the House floor. This, of course, once this is finished, it's going to move to the Senate. And the Senate has not been typically as significantly a supportive place for President Trump. They have gone along with him at many turns. He has a couple hardcore supporters in the Senate, but as Chuck was alluding to, and you have been talking about, Mitch McConnell has signaled that he's pleased that this impeachment's going forward and that he's open to a conviction. He said that his office put out part of the note that he sent to his Republican colleagues today, where he said exactly that he was thinking about voting to convict this president. He didn't say he had made up his mind one way or the other, but that is a really, really striking statement from the majority leader here in the Senate. It doesn't mean that there are the 17 Republican votes that they would need to convict, but it potentially leaves the door open to actually making it so that Donald Trump can never hold office again. Savannah.
Yeah, Casey, I think you compared it to white smoke coming out of the Vatican, a huge signal. Lester?
We've been watching the vote totals on the screen. A reminder, some of those numbers may change. Votes may be switched. It takes longer these days because of COVID protocols, not wanting to have everyone in the same area at the same time. But we'll continue to watch that vote play out. In the meantime, I want to bring in Chief White House Correspondent Peter Alexander. Peter, while this debate was going on, we heard from the president. What did he say?
Yeah, that's right, Lester. This president is increasingly isolated. In the words of a former White House official, he is sullen and defiant right now. We're told that he watched most of today's proceeding, this debate over the course of the last couple of hours from inside the Oval Office and the adjacent dining room. And earlier, given the ban that he has now from Twitter and other social media outlets looking for a way to communicate his thoughts in real time, the White House did provide a statement to Fox News, later shared widely, where the president, among other things, now exactly a week after that violent mob we saw storm the Capitol, the president called for Americans to ease tensions and calm tempers. I'll read part of what he said in this statement. He said, "In light of reports of more demonstrations, I urge that there must be no violence, no law breaking, and no vandalism of any kind. That is not what I stand for, and it is not what America stands for." It's notable, this statement from the president, because just 24 hours, the president accepted no responsibility, showed no remorse for what took place last week. He called his comments that preceded the violent siege totally appropriate. And also notable right now, and a former White House official tells us what they are struck by as they witness this is that the president really does not have any voice in this process. The speed with which it's occurring means that the president doesn't have any hearings. He has no legal counsel defending him, no sort of defense other than from some of his allies up there on Capitol Hill today. Jim Jordan, who the president awarded the Medal of Freedom earlier this week, reading that statement that I just shared moments earlier. But the difference between the way this White House is now versus a year ago during the first impeachment is dramatic. Last time there were legal advisors, White House officials who were huddling, coming out to speak to reporters. This time the place is much more chaotic, and in many ways it's really a ghost town. Hard to get any clear sense of where things stand, and much more difficult, almost impossible, to find anybody in and around this White House willing to come out and publicly defend this president.
All right, Peter, thank you. Let me bring in Chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell. So, Andrea, presuming the votes are there and that they vote to impeach here over the next hour, what happens next? We know Mitch McConnell's office now signaling they won't take it up before inauguration, and he's not even sure where he's going to vote, despite reports that he was leaning toward impeachment. So where does this go?
Well, first of all, we have to see how the vote goes, because so far, as I'm now looking at the screen, there are about 5 Republicans who have already voted for it. That's not a final vote. They can always change their vote. We're told that 7 have said they will vote for it. So already this looks like this will be bipartisan. Certainly the signal from Liz Cheney that Chuck was referring to was terribly important. That is what Steny Hoyer was using in his closing argument, repeatedly saying that the number 3 ranking Republican, who is a rising star in the party, is the person who said that there's been no greater betrayal of the Constitution and of his office than what this President of the United States has done. That said, it's going to be delivered to the Senate, but the Senate is not in session, and the Senate can only be called back in session by unanimous consent or by agreement of Senators McConnell and Schumer, the Democratic and Republican leaders. And so if that does not happen, it's really all up to Mitch McConnell. He can block this from having any floor action if he wants until after January 20th. Or he can make a decision that when the Senate comes back on January 19th, it is heard, or he can decide to do it sooner. It's really all up to him. Chuck Schumer and the Democrats have no control over that. It's going to be delivered to the clerk of the Senate, and that is where it'll sit until and unless they are called back into session. Lester?
All right, Andrea, let me send it over to Savannah now.
Yeah, and I want to bring into this conversation former acting Solicitor General and NBC News legal analyst Neil Katyal. And Professor Katyal, by all chances, if this comes over to the Senate, it will be after the president has left office. Legally, is that permissible? Is there a debate as to that question?
I think it is permissible. So 3 facts just right at the outset struck me before getting to your question. First, the location of this debate going on. It's on our hallowed floor of Congress, but it's also a crime scene. Second, this is all going on against the backdrop of thousands of troops now in Washington, D.C., projected to be 15,000, which is far more than we have in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan combined. And then third, Savannah, as you said, this is not the president's first rodeo. He already was impeached a year ago. And so now the question is, can he be impeached even if he's going to leave office? And the Constitution, our founders were very wise. They said there's 2 different things that happen when you've been impeached and convicted. One is you can be removed from office, but the other is you can be barred, a lifetime bar from future office holding. That's in the text of the Constitution itself. And indeed, in 1876, Secretary Belknap of the War Department was impeached and convicted after he had left office. So I think it's certainly possible. There is a debate about if an impeachment starts after someone has fully left office, but that's one reason why you see the House moving with such velocity right now. The impeachment process has begun while Donald Trump is president.
One of the objections that we heard today from the Republican side of the aisle was there's no process here, that there weren't hearings, there weren't witnesses, that you are taking on this weighty matter of impeaching the president, but rushing it through and ramming it through with just a week left in the president's administration. What do you think there's merit? Does that set a precedent that might disturb you?
I mean, now they want to have witnesses and so on. Remember last year, they were all saying there should be no witnesses, there should be a streamlined process. And last year was actually complicated. You did need a bunch of witnesses. Here,
that was in the Senate though, right?
Investigate. Excuse me, but even in the Senate, the president's actions here really do speak for themselves. And, if this were a criminal case in which the question were his mens rea, his level of intent, then I could see the need for some extensive process. But otherwise, I think the case here is you've got a guy who said what he said. He said so after he was warned not to. Gabe Sterling, the Georgia official, on December 1st said, Mr. President, don't say this kind of stuff. Stop it. Otherwise, someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed. That's what he said on December 1st. What did the president do? Kept saying the same nonsense and incitements. And so, I don't know what process there is past the process that we've had.
Okay, well, we continue to keep our eye on this roll call vote. And if you're just tuning in, the House is in the midst of impeaching President Donald Trump for the second time. There are Republicans who are crossing the aisle for this vote. We have reports of 8 total so far that we know of who will join the Democrats who are united in voting to impeach him this afternoon. Now, Lester, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, we see 6 on that tally board right now, but of course that continues to change. Senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson is standing by right now. Hallie, I think everyone is watching that Republican number, and certainly Republicans in the Senate as they decide which way they want to go.
No kidding, Lester. Savannah mentioned the tally, as far as NBC News has confirmed, is up to 8 House Republicans now. And that is because just as we were talking and having this conversation during the vote, you had Ohio Republican Congressman Anthony Gonzalez, coming out saying that he feels compelled to support impeachment as well. You can see the statement there from Congressman Gonzalez. So you heard Chuck talk about the impact of Congresswoman Liz Cheney coming out supporting impeachment, what that meant. We are starting to see some of the impact of that now as this vote is unfolding. Keep in mind that as you look at those numbers, as you look at the tally, those things could change until this vote is gavelled, which is why we are cautious about talking about vote totals until they're actually gavelled in. But I have to tell you, Lester, one of the things that I found interesting in my reporting on this over the last 24 hours has been the startling, in the eyes of some, lack of outreach, or perhaps not so startling, depending how you see it, from the White House to those on the Hill. There is no whip effort that is happening. There is no big push to try to get House Republicans in line and on board with the president. One person that I spoke with pointed to, for example, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and said very sarcastically, boy, it looks like he has it handled, huh? You also have somebody who normally would be taking on some of that role, Vice President Mike Pence, who has consistently throughout the course of this administration leaned on his past, his relationships, his history with these members of Congress to be a liaison between the White House and between Capitol Hill. For very obvious reasons, that is not happening now. The vice president is continuing his public schedule. We now have word of a trip he's going to take to West Virginia later on this week, but he is certainly not that present on Capitol Hill with his relationship, at least is described to me by my sources, broken with President Trump. Sure, they spoke earlier this week. It was by most accounts cordial, perfectly normal, but certainly not the kind of meeting that they would have had, let's say, 6 weeks, 2 months ago, 3 years ago even. So the absence of any kind of impact or any kind of pressure from the White House, discussions from the White House, is notable. And I think that it is not to be missed, not to be understated. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, who was, as Savannah and Casey were talking about, walking that line, decrying in some ways the president's actions, but not going so far as to cross the line on impeachment. Now the ball goes to the Senate Republicans, and there is a question there of how many Senate Republicans you could get on board. It is not clear at this point. The timeline is becoming clear. It's going to stretch into the early days of the Biden administration. I spoke with, for example, a Democratic leader in Congress who had initially supported pressing pause on that, maybe delaying sending this article of impeachment, if it passes as expected, over to the Senate until President-elect Biden gets a little further into his term, just so you're not juggling all this stuff. It seems as though the headwinds are moving in the other direction, partly because Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has suggested that he will move fairly quickly on this. There's not going to be a ton of foot dragging, Lester.
All right, Hallie Jackson, thank you. Joining us now, Jake Sherman, who covers Congress as the co-founder of Punchbowl News, and he's an NBC News political contributor, and Eugene Robinson, Washington Post columnist and associate editor, and also an NBC News political contributor. Good to have both of you for our coverage. Eugene, let me start with you if I can. The Republican defense of President Trump was tepid at best. Mainly, this seemed to be about the idea that this was political. But does that ring a bit more hollow than it did the last time? We're no longer in an election year.
Yeah, it rang very hollow. I mean, you heard the Matt Gaetzes of the world. You heard the true believers, the members of the Republican members of Congress who are closest to President Trump, give a more vigorous defense. Yes, the defense was generally pretty tepid. Well, one thing you did not hear from Republicans, except from Kevin McCarthy, who kind of said it, is the whole central point of this whole argument, which is Joe Biden won a free and fair election over Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost that election. It was a normal, free and fair election, and it just did not work out the way Donald Trump wanted it to. And you did not hear that from Republicans, except maybe from Kevin McCarthy. You certainly did not hear that in the statement that President Trump released during the debate, calling for calm, calling for no more violence. But again, not acknowledging the central issue, the whole reason for the, quote, Stop the Steal rally in the first place, is that he lost the election. Until there's a reckoning on that fact, I think we should continue to be concerned, not just about Inauguration Day, but what happens afterwards. There has to be an acknowledgement that just happened, and there wasn't a full acknowledgement today.
For what purpose is the gentlewoman from
The Hill, you know the Hill very well, Jake. You're doing some head counting too. I mean, there was talk before this day that at least 5 Republicans might cross over. Seems the number is up to 8. I'm sure you're keeping an eye on it too. But what would be a number so significant that it might change the analysis in terms of the Senate? Because it feels like right now the way Mitch McConnell has this posture is, I'm waiting and seeing, I'm going to see which way this goes, and the scales could tip, but it really seems like he's waiting to see how many Republicans defect today.
It's exactly right, Savannah. Great question. I would say that number is somewhere between 15 and 20. A vote that healthy, that overwhelming would obviously make a lot of senators think about their calculus. Because remember, a lot of the senators who are up for election in 2022 or 2024 could face challenges from conservative or right-leaning Republicans in the House of Representatives. So they're going to be watching this very closely. But I agree with what Casey said earlier, which is Mitch McConnell is not ruling out the fact that he might vote to convict Donald Trump. I think that's incredibly important to note, because the last time President Trump was impeached, he came out of the gates and said, this is meritless, this is meaningless, and we all know how this is going to end. It was something along those lines. He's not saying that now. There is no defense. The defense is this is a rush process. We've not heard a single substantive, really, defense of what the president did, just trashing Democrats or the riots from last summer. So again, just a really, really notable split, incredibly notable split based on the last couple of years, that we could have upwards of 10, as many as 20 Republicans vote to impeach Donald Trump, and then it goes over to the Senate.
Yeah, and we're up to 9 now, just so you know, Jake. We just, our calculation is we've got 9 Republicans crossing over. So those are the numbers we're watching, Lester.
Yeah, Eugene, I want to ask you about what the end game here is, especially for Republicans, and what Mitch McConnell had reportedly said in some of the reporting leading up today. Is part of this getting him out of the game, erasing him from the Republican calculation going forward?
Well, I think that's what Mitch McConnell would like to do, and I think that's what a lot of Republicans would like to do. But other Republicans either would not want to do that or don't think it's possible or are afraid to try. I mean, the assumption, I think, is that Donald Trump is likely to have a lot of influence over the Republican base one way or another, after he's out of office. And I think Mitch McConnell sees potentially the opportunity to really reduce that and to take the party back. I mean, Trump did conduct a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and establishment Republicans would love to take it back. But the Mitch McConnell's and Liz Cheney of the party may not right now have the power to do that. That's going to be the great uncertainty for the party going forward.
All right, Eugene and Jake, thanks to both of you. I want to go back to Casey Hunt on Capitol Hill. She's not only watching this count along with us, but she may be ahead of it in terms of what we're hearing from some of the members. Casey, what's the latest?
Well, Lester, we are up to 9 Republican members of the House who have voted to impeach President Trump. The one surprise, Congressman Tom Rice of South Carolina. We didn't have a statement from him ahead of his vote. And we should just remind everyone that as long as this vote's open, members of Congress can go in and change their votes. But his has stood at a yes, impeach the president for quite some time now. So we wanted to make sure that we got it onto our list. Otherwise, it's still that list that we have been talking about. Congressman Katko from New York was the first Republican to come out. He said last night he was going to vote to do this. You also have Fred Upton from Michigan, as you've been talking about extensively. Liz Cheney from Wyoming, who came out and said that this was a constitutional matter and that she was going to vote to impeach Donald Trump. Again, she is the number 3 elected Republican leader in the House. She is a very top-ranking official there, and of course the daughter of Dick Cheney, the former vice president. So a pretty significant stand for her. Some others, Peter Meyer is a freshman congressman from Michigan. He has come out a couple times in the last couple of days talking about just how difficult this week has been for other members, for his colleagues, and what they all have been facing personally in a way that's really made him stand out. This is, of course, just his first couple of weeks here in the House of Representatives. Adam Kinzinger of Illinois also voting for impeachment. We knew he was going to do that. He was the only Republican to support invoking the 25th Amendment, which of course they voted on late last night in the House. Otherwise, we've all been focused on impeachment. So we still have quite a few Republicans outstanding. As many as 80 have yet to vote. So we're still keeping a very close eye on this. As Jake said, the estimates we had going in here, I had heard between 6 and 12 initially, and then once Liz Cheney came out, there were some estimates that it could be higher than that, but it does seem like we're going to be in a little bit of a lower range here. And I think the question here is it enough to underscore the depth of anger at President Trump to get Republican senators to vote to convict him? And it's clear Mitch McConnell has said that he is open to that. He's also said he's not going to start any trial until at least January 19th. So that does give a period of time for people to reflect, to learn more perhaps about what happened. The reality here is that the more that we have learned about this attack, the more, frankly, terrifying it is. And the clearer it's become that we had a very, very narrow miss of something far, far worse, even as bad as we knew it was when it was unfolding on Wednesday. There's also the question of whether the president continues to incite his supporters or takes steps to try and calm the situation. They put out a written statement today that seemed to be in the calming direction, but we also know that the president often is at odds with his own aides. He had put out a statement on Wednesday, a video statement, that he later seemed to suggest he regretted doing it all. So I think there are a lot of Republicans watching to see what President Trump himself does over the course of the next week as we try and figure out if this transition of power is actually going to be peaceful ahead of the inauguration. I got to tell you, Lester, it's it's both reassuring and unsettling, I would say, to have come into this building and this morning to dozens of National Guard troops, people in military uniforms sleeping on the floors here in the Capitol. It's only happened a handful of times in our history since troops were quartered here in the Civil War. And I know everyone who's up here is grateful that they're here to prevent what happened on Wednesday, but also it's a pretty terrifying reminder that we are not out of the woods yet in terms of what may unfold both here in Washington and also in state capitals across the country. Lester.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. Just a week ago, you and I sitting here describing the events as they transpired, many of them right outside those doors we're looking at right now. Casey, thanks. We'll go back as we watch the tally. You can see a number of members have not voted yet. Von Hilliard on the streets of Washington now. He has a look at the security measures now in place that Casey was just talking about. Von?
Lester, you guys were just talking about those National Guards members. We should note, I had a conversation with an official from the Department of Defense just today who tells me there are now more than 6,600 National Guardsmen on the scene here in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of them are behind me here. We should note, just 1 week ago when, Lester, you and I spoke, all that was up, essentially keeping the general public away from the steps of the Capitol, was about a 4-foot little guard rail. What you see now today is a 7-foot fence here erected with hundreds of National Guardsmen helping Capitol Police here. But this is not the only layer. I want to give folks an idea of where we're at right now. We're here at the intersection of 1st Street and East Capitol. And as you go across the street, you'll see the U.S. Supreme Court, which is part of these Capitol grounds. But there's another fence, another 7-foot fence that extends the perimeter back another about 250 yards up to 2nd Street. And National Guardsmen as well as Capitol Police are also protecting that area there. I was talking to the Department of Defense official here who tells me the other significant news of the day is the fact that the Secretary of the Army approved National Guardsmen to be armed. That is where you saw here today for the first time individuals, these guardsmen, actually armed here around Washington, D.C. It's tough to get around anywhere from here, from the Capitol, all the way down to the White House now. We were here earlier when some cargo trucks were being loaded with M4 rifles and being taken here around the city. I mean, we should note, Lester, you've been around enough inaugurations. This is not typically what Washington, D.C. looks like a week before inauguration. But it's telling to know what is happening inside right now with these impeachment proceedings, and the fact that there is this extensive of a perimeter a week before inauguration and while these impeachment proceedings are underway. Lester?
Yeah, Vaughn, and I had seen somebody had tweeted a little bit earlier a frame grab of an Apple map, and it showed all the closures in the D.C. area. How is the city, how is government even able to function right now under that kind of lockdown?
You know, we have to have our media badge to get to where our bureau is at, which is not on the Capitol grounds. That is the extent to which the greater D.C. is shut down. These National Guardsmen, we should note, are not just here to aid law enforcement, but they're also here to help serve as medical support. They're here for traffic purposes, logistical support. Washington, D.C. is essentially shut down here over the course of this next week. You know, we should know yesterday, folks were still traveling down this roadway here, and the Department of Defense official telling me, yes, there are 6,600 National Guardsmen now. They expect that number to be ramped up all the way to 15,000 by next Wednesday.
All right, Von Hilliard, thank you for watching and bringing us that scene outside the Capitol. Let's go back to Savannah now.
Yeah, and Lester, joining me on the phone is Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, a Republican who crossed the aisle just now and voted yes for impeachment. Congressman, it's good to have you with us. First of all, why you felt compelled to cast this vote today. You also, I should mention, voted yesterday to have Vice President Pence invoke the 25th Amendment to remove the president from office immediately, a vote that failed. Tell me about your vote, and are you worried, frankly, about paying a political price for it?
You know, I voted this way because if the president, the Article 2 branch of the Constitution inciting an insurrection against Article 1 is not impeachable, then we almost maybe should just throw away that whole process. This was, you know, an attack on American democracy. It's not just about the violence. This is about the message about American democracy, which is exactly the process we use to prevent violence in this country. So I think it was the right vote. Do I worry about my political future? Not really, because honestly, I never got into this to build some political empire. I did it to do the right thing, and I am in total peace today that my vote was the right thing, and I actually think history will judge it that way.
When you listen to the arguments of your Republican colleagues arguing against impeachment, there was a lot of talk about this being a very divisive vote, that this wouldn't unify the country. They talked about the process being rushed and that being unfair to the president. How do you respond to those arguments?
Well, you know, I don't want to question motives because everybody, of course, is a deeply tough decision. But bottom line is, yeah, it's rushed because We were rushed by a mob, and the president is president for the next 7 days, and we all lived it. You don't need to get further evidence when you were in the middle of it, and you have all this evidence that's videotaped. And in terms of division, it may. But the real thing, the real person that stoked the division in this country that led to what happened was the president of the United States. And so I think we have to. This is a vote that gets us. We have to get out of the comfort of making political decisions and turn into the fact that this is a oath-making, oath-keeping, historical books vote. And frankly, I want to be on the right side of history, and I want to feel peace that I followed through on the oath that I've taken in the military and as Congress.
As we've been chatting here, a 10th Republican has crossed the aisle and voted, along with the Democrats and with you, to impeach the president. But you said you don't want to question motives, fair enough, but are you disappointed that more Republicans have not joined your view of things? I mean, there are 211 Republicans in the House. You're talking about a handful taking this action under pretty extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah, I am disappointed. I mean, it's I think, quite honestly, a lot of the motivation to vote against this is fear. It's fear of politics, maybe the fear of safety. I can understand that fear, but the bottom line is this transcends that. I certainly wish there were more. There aren't, and that's okay. We will go forward. This process goes forward, but as a party and as a country, we have to have a real look inside and fix things, because we cannot sustain politics like it's been happening.
I don't know how much you have your ear to the ground, but I'm sure you saw the signal that was sent pretty transparently from Mitch McConnell's office. There was a report in the New York Times that he was pleased the Democrats were pursuing impeachment. He has indicated now that he's open and will listen to the arguments. It's a huge change in posture versus, say, a year ago with the previous impeachment. What do you think might happen with your colleagues over on the Senate side? Do you think there's an actual chance that Republicans could cross over in the Senate and convict and remove the president?
I certainly do. And if you look at the day of the attacks on the Capitol, first off, there were, just a handful of people that were going to object. So they take that part of the job a little more seriously, I think, than some over on this side. And, that number was cut in half after the riots, which is sad that, in fact, there were still. But if you look at the House, there were still 130 people that objected to certification after the attempted insurrection. So I hope the Senate does the right thing. I think they will. I do, but, all I know is I'm responsible for my vote. I feel at peace with my vote, but it was definitely a very weighty and heavy day in America.
And finally, I heard over and over again the argument on the Republican side, hey, where was the outrage when there was looting and rioting on the streets this summer after protests over racial justice? That there was hypocrisy now and outrage when there wasn't outrage before. How do you see that argument? Do you see a distinction?
No, I think it is a false equivalency. So, look, I condemn the violence in the summer. I think it was egregious, but there's a very big difference between violence and burning down part of a city, which, quite honestly, is obviously bad, but that versus attacking the branch of government that represents the people, that represents the functioning democracy that prevents violence every day by the fact that politics exists. There is no equivalence, and it was a disappointing thing to hear.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, thank you for your time this afternoon. I know it's a busy one. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Lester, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, just a handful of members have not voted yet. As we look at that tally, it continues. Nothing final there. Votes could change, but we'll continue to monitor the count. NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, joins us now. Chuck, you got to wonder how this is being viewed by the Biden transition team right now.
Well, I mean, I think they look at it in some ways. They're trying to not focus on it. You've heard. President-elect Biden has talked about seeing if he could have some sort of split-screen Senate trial, meaning they do half days of the trial, because the Biden team is concerned that this could derail things for them, that, for whatever it is, it delays confirmations, and of course, there's some worst-case scenario that somehow this would polarize things and make it even harder because everybody goes more party line. I don't happen to believe that. I think this is becoming bipartisan enough that you're starting to see these will be the first Republicans that are part of any Biden governing coalition. You know, these are, you look at many of these Republicans, some of them come from a very conservative place like Liz Cheney in Wyoming, but she is very, I think, confident in her own standing, a la an Adam Kinzinger, who feels as if he doesn't have to worry about the base, that he's sort of an established political figure. But many of these some of these others that have voted yes on impeachment come from swing areas, come from areas that aren't just dominated by one propaganda news voice, but are more diverse areas generally, culturally, politically, and things like that. And so I think that gives you a clue. If you're getting ready to head up the Biden Congressional Liaison Office, you're looking already, you're scouring these speeches, you're looking at the 10 that voted, you're looking at the people that didn't talk today. You know, it's interesting, there's a Congressman, Mike McCall, who was somebody I was keeping an eye on. He's a longtime member of Congress from Texas, not far from Austin, is very much sort of what you would call a mainstream Republican from sort of the pre-Trump era. And he voted no on impeachment, but then he said, I do fear the more I learn that maybe this vote's going to be on the wrong side of history. So again, if you're the Biden folks, it's obviously an opportunity to find out who can you work with? Because I know this, there are 140 House members they cannot.
Yeah, Chuck, let me just focus everyone back on the floor. Nancy Pelosi appears to be making her way back up near the podium. While she does that, I want to bring in on the phone now House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, Democrat of Maryland. Congressman, thank you for being with us. You appear to be minutes away. Actually, I'm watching Speaker Pelosi, but you appear to be minutes away from an impeachment. Let me ask you the question many Republicans asked today. That is, what's the point if the president would be tried after his term?
Lester, what I said on the floor, I referred to Liz Cheney's remarks that said, and I'm quoting, there's never been a greater betrayal by a president of the United States of his office and his oath to the Constitution. And the point I made after that was that if the Congress were to do nothing in the face of that historic misfeasance, and urging to violence, frankly, people to attack the Capitol to, as he and his followers said, stop the steal, I think we would be derelict in our duty to the American people. And even though there's a short time left and the American people have already decided they wanted a new president and elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I think it was incumbent, and our members clearly thought it was incumbent, and you saw many papers throughout the land urging action. The Wall Street Journal itself urged him to resign. They did not urge impeachment, but they urged him to resign. And the object of impeachment was to remove him as quickly as possible, but also to ensure that he does not run for president again. So,
as we watch this vote near its conclusion right now, looks like up to 10 Republicans will side with Democrats. Does that number disappoint you? Would you have hoped for a larger number when all the votes are counted?
Lester, I would have hoped for a unanimous vote on this issue. That was, of course, not what my expectation was. Am I disappointed by 10? No, I'm pleased that 10 people had the courage, as Liz Cheney and as a number of others, including Adam Kissinger, and others, to stand up and say, in light of this egregious violation of his oath, the Constitution, and the norms of our democracy, we have no alternative. But I'm pleased.
Do you think that fear was at work?
Of course, I think fear is work, and I said that on the floor. I think that there are literally there are 197 Republicans voting no at this point in time. I don't know how. I would imagine that a number of those, just ideologically and temperamentally, are aligned with Donald Trump. But I think there, the 197, I would be surprised if there weren't at least half of those votes based upon the fear of retribution, either through tweets or some other action that the president would take, which would undermine their own political careers.
Have all members voted?
The president...
I am placing a note that to buy...
I'm sorry, it looks like Nancy Pelosi speaking.
Sell British pound.
She has asked if anyone wants to change their vote, so they are coming very close to closing this vote. But there are the numbers as they stand at this moment. Those are not final numbers you're looking at. Let's bring in Casey Hunt right now, who is watching along with us. Casey, at what point is the vote formally closed?
So, Lester, we are waiting, and I don't want to step on the House Speaker because it's going to be the moment that everyone is waiting for. But she is about to gavel this closed, unless, of course, there are a significant number of members who are coming to her and saying that they wish to change their vote. I mean, that could take a moment or so. But
the ayes
here we go.
are 232. The nays are 197. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Congratulations.
So the House has impeached Donald Trump for the second time, but for the first time with Republicans, 10 Republicans crossing the aisle to vote for impeachment, including the number 3 Republican, Liz Cheney, daughter of a former vice president, in an extraordinary moment, 1 week, almost to the hour, after rioters stormed the Capitol, leaving 5 dead.
The chair announces that pursuant to Section 3A of House Resolution 41, the House Resolution 40 is hereby adopted.
And dotting the I there, but again, as you note, Savannah, President Trump has been impeached again.
Clause 11 of Rule 1, in the order the following of the House of January 4th, 2021, of the following members of the House to the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence.
Let's bring it.
Mr. Schiff of California, Chair. Mr. Nunes of California.
So we'll continue to keep our eye on the floor, but the action now moves to the Senate. And there is some suspense, Chuck, as I bring you into this conversation into what exactly could happen there. Now, we know something of the when. We know it won't be before January 19th. The Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, has made that clear as of today. He is not going to use any mechanism to try to bring the Senate back in early. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader of the Senate, had been floating an idea to do that, but that is not going to happen. So we won't see the Senate in session until at least January 19th. But the question is, then what? How might a trial proceed? Will Republicans cross over to convict? Will enough to remove from office or ban President Trump from holding future federal office if he's already left? Because, of course, the other date to mark on your calendar, January 20th, which is the date that the new president is inaugurated.
Well, here's one thing I would say. Today's January 13th. The start of this trial is January 19th. We're going to learn a lot in 6 days. We're going to get more. Well, every hour we see more people charged. We learn more information about the plot from last week. There is more facts that are filled in. And ask yourself, how much more will we know on January 19th than we know today? That said, you never know what time does, right? What is that? What does time do? Does time calm the waters in the GOP? Does suddenly Lindsey Graham, who apparently is becoming the chief defender against impeachment for President Trump in the Senate, does he have some success finding, he needs at this point to find, to sort of lock in approximately 35 Republicans to do this.
And don't forget the biggest X factor, Chuck, which is President Trump himself. I noted, I noted that President Trump making his first public appearance, his live public appearance yesterday on his way to Texas, his remarks were followed within just a matter of hours by Mitch McConnell, that report in the New York Times saying, maybe he's open to impeachment. And it's very notable. I mean, it's Washington. We read into things maybe when we shouldn't, but I thought that was very striking. Last week, Mitch McConnell said, you're not going to have any trial. Don't even think about it. And then within hours of the president saying, a lot of people think what I said and how I conducted myself on the day of the riot was totally appropriate. Within hours, Mitch McConnell with the shot across the bow, hey, this isn't over.
Look, we're still trying to confirm all of that timing. But I'm with you. I thought the entire thing was, it almost now in hindsight, especially Lindsey Graham traveling with the president yesterday, it almost looked like McConnell was like, okay, I'll give you to the end of the day to see if you can get some sort of contrition out of him. Didn't happen. Literally within minutes of him being wheels up from Texas back to D.C., there's that headline in the New York Times. I'm with you. Nothing in this town happens by accident. That is something you learn the longer you cover this place. But look, I think that it's the time issue is one unknown factor. But I'll tell you this. I know of a lot of polling that's being done about this. And I'll tell you, the Republican grassroots have not abandoned Donald Trump. And none of us know how that impacts some of these Republican senators, right? Are they going to be moved by polls or not? Are there 17 Republicans that are thinking the way it appears Mitch McConnell is thinking and going, you know what? Okay, short-term politics, getting rid of impeachment might be a good idea. But long-term, having Donald Trump around is not a good idea for the party. So maybe we take the long-term vote. And I'll tell you this, if Mitch McConnell is indeed a yes on impeachment, I promise you there are 16 other Republicans that will join with him.
Wow, well, that's quite the statement, Chuck. We'll see how this all plays out over the coming days. Lester, I'll send it to you. You were in a good conversation with Congressman
Majority Leader
Hoyer.
Congressman Hoyer rejoins me. Thank you for your patience as we watch that vote come in. I want to ask you, we've seen with this president outrage sometimes. Yeah, outrage is sometimes measured in a matter of days, and then we move on to the next thing. Come January 20th, new president, all the attention around that. Do you think that attention will wane from wanting to further to prosecute a trial against the president?
Well, again, the egregiousness of the actions of the president, which, as I say, not us, but Cheney, I think, really captured very, very well. I think it's important that we act, and if in fact Mitch McConnell is thinking of the long-term ramifications, as Chuck was referring to, then I think he would choose to continue, and therefore under the 14th Amendment and under impeachment itself, he would be unable to run for office. I think, frankly, Senator McConnell and others are worried about his long-term adverse impact on the party.
The president put out a statement while you were all debating today, urging there be no violence, no law breaking, no violence, vandalism of any kind. He's addressing reports that some of his supporters may be planning further action. Is he relevant anymore in terms of cooling the temperature on this? Is there anything he can say that might change the outcome of all this?
Well, you would hope so. You would hope that his followers, who are obviously very, very strongly influenced by him. That's our whole contention on the actions that happened at the Capitol on the night of the 6th and the morning of the 7th, that they were impelled by the President of the United States. So clearly he has a lot of influence, and hopefully he will urge these folks who are talking about violence, insurrection on the 17th and the 19th, and perhaps violence on the 20th. Hopefully he will legitimately and sincerely and work with his people to convince folks that they ought not to be doing this. I will tell you, though, that there are some of these folks that I don't think anybody has any influence over, other than, as he did on Wednesday, stoke their anger, stoke their mission of preventing the Congress from acting on confirming the Electoral College vote. But if he turns on them, which I think he is very reluctant to do, as he was in Charlottesville, because they are such a strong part of his base that he motivates politically. And so he's in a tough situation in that sense, but he ought to do the right thing, but so often he does not do that.
All right. Congressman Steny Hoyer, thank you so much for giving us so much time today. It was good to talk to you, sir.
You bet. Thanks, Lester. Thanks,
All right, Savannah.
Thank you. Let's go to our Chief White House Correspondent, Peter Alexander, who's on duty. And Peter, The White House response, what the president might say now having been impeached a second time, certainly a question that a lot of us have. He has been deprived of his favorite megaphone, Twitter. He's off of Instagram, Facebook, and the like, but we have seen a paper statement from him today. Do you expect to hear more from the president today?
Yeah, Savannah, that's exactly right, and I am told by administration officials that it's likely this evening in the form of a video we will hear from the President of the United States tonight. That video yet to be recorded. Of course, it comes as the president's now become the first in 245 years of this nation's history to be impeached twice. And it's notable that as that vote was taking place, I'm told that the president was inside the Oval Office awarding the National Medal of Arts to two country singers, Ricky Skaggs and Toby Keith. So at the end of the day, as his presidency winds down, just 7 days to go, the president, while he was being impeached again, was instead handing out awards to a pair of country singers here at the White House right now. Also worth noting today is, as I've been in the West Wing over the course of this day, this place is increasingly a ghost town. There are fewer and fewer people that are around the president, certainly not the legal advisors that you would anticipate at a time like this as compared to the impeachment almost exactly a year ago. And even some of the president's closest advisors have departed as well. NBC News has now been told that Hope Hicks, one of the president's top aides, really a confidant, I think you could describe, this is her last day, was her last day, having now departed the White House. I'm told by those familiar with her plans that she had planned to depart this week since the president lost in November, that this was not a decision made after the riots last week. Nonetheless, it does mean again for these last 7 days here of the Trump presidency, depending on what happens with this impeachment, there are fewer and fewer of those voices, some of them moderating voices around the president. But again, to answer your question specifically, Savannah, again, we do wait to hear from this president this evening. The only statement we'd heard from him over the course of this day in the form of a paper statement circumventing social media because he doesn't have that access anymore, calling on Americans to ease tensions and calm tempers almost exactly 1 week after that awful violence at the Capitol.
It'll be interesting to see what tone he decides to strike with 100 jurors in the United States Senate now listening. Let me turn to somebody who knows this territory very well, Dan Goldman. He was majority counsel for the Democrats in the last impeachment inquiry and former director of investigations for the House Intelligence Committee. So, Dan, we remember seeing you a year ago, but then you were in the hot seat asking the questions. So let me ask you something. There are folks watching this today who might think, all right, I don't love the president's rhetoric last week. But what's the difference between fiery free speech and firing up a crowd and saying we got to fight and incitement that is impeachable? That was an argument we heard today from Republicans, that this is setting a precedent that violates free speech with really worrisome potential consequences and ramifications down the road. How would you respond?
Well, that's going to be the challenge for the House managers to prove in any Senate trial, is to link the president's knowledge to the plans to storm the Capitol and the plans to use violence to stop the certification of the votes. And, you know, I think when you look at it, first of all, in a Senate trial under Chuck Schumer's Democratic Party, there very well may be witnesses. There, of course, was no investigation in the House, so there are a lot of open questions. And in response to that defense, you're going to want to look at a couple things. First of all, you're going to look very closely at President Trump's Twitter feed. What was he retweeting? What was he saying? What kind of calls for violence are on his Twitter feed? Two, what requests were there in advance of the rally for additional security? And what did the White House do? Because we know there was insufficient security, and now we're getting reporting that there was a report from the FBI Norfolk office that there may be acts of war, and there was a lot of online language. So you want to know what role the White House played in rejecting requests for additional security. And then the third thing is, on the day of on January 6th, the day of the insurrection, why did the National Guard take so long to get there? Why does Governor Larry Hogan from Maryland say that he was not given authorization for 2 hours? What role did the White House have in preventing preventing security or additional military or law enforcement assistance to protect the Capitol. Those are the types of things that are going to be able to show the president's state of mind. And if you can show the president's state of mind that he was aware that there were plans for violence, then you are a long way toward proving incitement of an insurrection.
And let me throw another one at you. Another argument I heard a couple times today from Republicans was, hey, these are folks, some of these people came in with pipe bombs, they came in with zip ties, they had a plan, it was pre-planned, it was premeditated, they weren't waiting for a word from the president. What do you make of that argument? I've left him speechless, or we're living in a pandemic with Zoom. Okay, wait, go ahead. Sorry, we missed you for a minute, but I think we got your signal back up.
Sorry about that. I think we know that there were plans to storm the Capitol. That was online. That was very out in the open. And the question is, what did the president know about those plans? I find it very hard to believe that the president had no idea that there were plans to pursue violence when Rudy Giuliani gets up at the same rally and says, we are going to enlist trial by combat. What does that mean? That is not law and order. That's not something that Rudy Giuliani, a former U.S. attorney, would ever have said. There is no trial by combat. That is an act of violence. That's an incitement of violence. So the question then just becomes, what is the knowledge of the president? And it's very hard. I think there's a very good circumstantial case to be made, even based on what we know. But if you were to get someone like Dan Scavino, who's the head of the digital media strategy for the White House, under oath, and you're to ask him questions about whether he knew about these plans and whether he said anything to the president, I think those responses will be very interesting.
All right, real quick before I let you go, do you consider this, for lack of a better phrase, slam dunk? Is this a case you wish you could be prosecuting in the Senate?
Certainly, I think this is a case that any American should wish to pursue because it is functionally a anti-democratic coup that the president has been trying to orchestrate through lies and misinformation. I think the Republicans, as you saw today, 10 voted for impeachment. I think it's going to be a very, very different story over in the Senate as well, which is always a little bit more removed. But yes, I mean, look, there's a lot of investigation that you would want to do in any ordinary trial, given the timing here, given the emotions. You may not have that. But this was an act that is unconscionable in our democracy, and the president should be held accountable.
Dan Goldman, it's good to get your perspective. You're probably the best perspective we have today because you've been there. So thank you very much for your expertise. We appreciate it. Lester?
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, Savannah, I want to follow up your conversation now by bringing in Justice Correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, we're now talking about this Senate trial that would presumably begin either in the waning hours of the Trump presidency or after. So we're talking about a private citizen. What is the legality of going forward with an impeachment trial for someone who is out of office?
So the interesting thing is there seems to be very little pushback from the Senate about the possibility of doing this, and there is historical precedent. You talked earlier to Neil about this. President Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, was impeached by the House just a moments after he resigned, but he'd already been impeached. The trial went to the Senate. There was a discussion on the Senate floor. We don't have jurisdiction to hear this. He's no longer in office. That was defeated, and they went on to vote on his conviction. Now, as it turned out, it takes a 2/3 vote to convict, and they didn't have the 2/3 vote. But they thought it was appropriate to hold a trial.